Hello, everyone. We are very excited. Today, we have our first ever review and reflect. Typically, TJ and I bring this to you in written form on our blog, but we said, you know what? Let's bring in a practitioner, someone who's very well experienced as an educational leader, someone who gets the job done. So, with that, we are always trying to lead better and grow faster. So, we wanted to hear from Nick Hoover. Nick, thanks for joining us. We are so glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Definitely appreciate it.
All right, Nick, we're going to start here with the first level of content that we have, which is our blog post. But before we do, could you introduce yourself a little bit for our audience?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Nick Hoover, and I am principal of Meredith Middle School in the Appoquinimink School District in Middletown, Delaware. And yeah, just super excited to be here. I thank you guys. And, I'm a big fan of you guys from the very beginning. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for being on the show. Let's start with the age gap. So our blog post was about the age gap, really trying to analyze your development from where you are to then where you want to be in the future and what obstacles might be in the way for getting you there. What did you take away from that? What are your thoughts on it as a practitioner? How might you use that as a principal?
Yeah, sure. So first off, this was an excellent time to have me in because I really think all three of these we're going to talk about today was probably the best that I've seen from you. The blog post about H gap was really, I thought it was great. I've done something similar with my leadership team, like a gap analysis. So, we have our school goals and we're looking towards the future. Where are we currently? What are we looking to do? But here's the thing I took away from you guys, because typically when you're looking at that gap, you go, what are the things that we have to start, right? But what I thought was really great was the digging down deeper to say, what are the things you have to stop? And I think that was key for me. I mean, there's really not too many times where we're saying, oh, we have to stop this in order to get better. So that was a big takeaway for me. I loved it.
Yeah, the heart of it all, the H gap is hindrance. It's short for hindrance,
Mhm.
and it's those little things that we need to stop doing that trip us up. And when we think about behaviors, especially if you're a goal-oriented person, you think about what you have to do next to motivate that change, to motivate others to accomplish those goals. But a lot of times, it's what you have to stop doing because it's getting in the way of achievement. And a lot of those things we actually may even enjoy doing, they're just not that productive. And that's what's tough. But if you get into that where you are, where you want to be, identify that field, if you will, it not only gets you to start thinking about it from your own lens as the leader of the school, but it also those teacher leaders, other leaders in the building and so on, how they start, moving forward and eliminating really just tasks and other ideas, thoughts that just might not get you where you need to go.
Yeah, you know what it made me think of? We actually have done this without the thinking part behind it, and one of the toughest parts was this was ingrained in the culture for years. There was something we ended up just saying, guys, putting in a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort, and it's just not yielding what we're looking to do. But it was something we have been doing for a long time, and so it was kind of tough to break that. But we're breaking it and then trying to kind of rebrand it into something different. So before we move off, though, I did want to say there was one sentence where I thought was just well written. I don't know which one of you wrote this, but it was really well written. It was talking about the why, and I wrote it down here. Our need for the why. And you said, without understanding, we end up chasing goals that leave us empty and unfulfilled. I thought that was the strongest line in that blog. I'm sure we've all been there, whether it's a school goal or a personal goal, where you set this goal because you think you're supposed to do it. And then you might even reach the goal and just go, all right, great. And it didn't really give you anything. And I thought that was a super powerful sentence there.
Yeah, and that is the purpose, right, is fulfillment and making sure that the community is taken care of, and that we're not just setting these arbitrary, but also goals that, you know, don't mean anything to people in the long run. And so as schools, we can fulfill so many needs for our students. And sometimes we set goals that aren't necessarily going to do that. And it really does put us into the lens of academics. And academics are important, but there's so many other cool goals that schools can set to help their kids, to help their communities, and to help their families. And we've seen that in COVID more than ever, right? Is just being able to feed people, being able to provide internet access and anything else. Those goals are just as important as mathematics and language arts. You know that, Nick, and I know you do a good job with that in your community. Let's move on to the books. In our Read This series, we always introduce 3 books to our audience. We were wondering if you've read any of the books we introduced, or if you were going to, what you might have gotten out of them if you did. I know you're a huge reader. I know you read every day. I'd love to hear about your reading cadence as well. Our audience is always looking for tips on how do you read so much, right?
Yeah, I definitely do read a lot. I'm averaging around 6 or 7 books a month, and I'm taking in a lot. I've honestly eliminated so many other things from my life. Before we started, I was telling you that I have a lawn guy, right? And I get some flack for that sometimes. But but that's 2 hours of my life that I actually use in a different way. Some people love cutting their grass and doing all that work, and I don't. And so I use that time in a different way. I do a lot of listening to books as well. And so I try to read a couple things going on at the same time. So right now I've got 3 books going on. One is a book study, kind of book club with my dad and my brother. And then I've got a leadership book I'm looking at, and doing some fiction as well. So I'm just trying to get well-rounded. And I feel like I just fill the time, the empty time with reading, and specifically listening. I mean, if you can get into listening to books, when you're getting ready in the morning, when you're showering, when you're making dinner, all the times that you can't actually sit and read, but you can still take in content, whether that's reading or podcast or whatever. So, that's just kind of my strategy. And so, and I try to do a wide variety, so I'm not getting too bogged down with the same stuff, so. But yeah, I did read 2 of these 3 books. Huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell. You guys pointed it out. Love his podcast, Revisionist History. It's just so awesome. I've read all of his books. David and Goliath was a real good one for me. In fact, TJ, you mentioned David and Goliath to me years and years ago. I mean, it might have been 8 years ago now. I hadn't picked it up until maybe two years ago, but really great book. There's a couple of really good points there, but I felt like what I took away from the book was that there are things that either build us up or put us down. But for me, what I took from it was that it could be the same exact thing could put you down that builds me up, right? And he uses this example in one of the sections. He was talking about remote misses and where Germany's bombing, England or London, and where Germany thought that was going to really tear their hearts out, but it actually did the complete opposite, right? And so it's just a mindset to me that something could happen to you. You're either going to let it hurt you or you're going to help, build yourself back up. And that's what I took from David and Goliath. But you talked about Upstream, one of my favorite books that I love the Heath brothers. This was such a good one. And I know as soon as I read the first page, if I remember correctly, TJ, I texted you, it was like, if you don't have Upstream, you got to get it, because it was just so good. And there were so many good parts to that. I could probably go on forever, but I loved his section about scarcity and tunneling. And just really the proactive piece. I'm constantly feeling like if you're not being proactive about stuff, you're just letting the world hit you, whether it's positive or negative, and you got to be proactive. So definitely one of my favorites, but I love all of the Heath brothers. Greatest Miracle, never heard of it. Joe mentioned it, never heard of it. Just like I do with all the read this series, it's now on my Amazon list, so it's in there. Of course, my Amazon list is super long, so but it's in there. So Yeah, sounds like an interesting one. Never heard of it though. So
It's funny how that works, right, Nick? I'm going to ask you two questions on
yeah.
that. One, outside of like read this, if you're devouring 6 books a month in some form, some capacity, you're a voracious reader. How are you transferring some of that information into improving yourself as a leader? Right. So it's not just another checkbox. And I think it actually goes back to that line you mentioned in the blog. If it's not fulfilling and satisfying, getting you where you need to be, then drop it. And
Mhm.
so obviously reading has resonated with you. It is taking you to another level. Let's spend some time right there, if you wouldn't mind, for a minute. How are you transferring what you're reading into actually improving you as a leader?
Yeah. Well, so let me talk about something real quick because you mentioned dropping there. Like I do drop books, by the way. I set kind of like a 50-page limit, right? If you haven't sold me in the first 50 pages, there's a good chance I'm not getting sold the rest of the book. So there are plenty of months where I'm picking up a book because I think it's going to be a good one. And, I'm 50, 60, 70 pages in and I'm just going, you know what? It hasn't really gotten me and I'm just going to end up dropping it. So I think that's one of those things about, if you're reading that much, you don't want to finish 300-page book and go, ugh, right? And so I think it's got to grab me at some point. So for me, what I typically do is I am taking some notes. So, as I'm reading the book, if I find like a really important passage or a quote or something, I get in my iPad and put it in my notes. And then at the end of the book, what I do is I read through those notes again, kind of synthesize the three. I try to keep it to three, but like upstream, I've got 4 bullets. But most books, I can get it down to 3 bullets. Just synthesize the absolute most powerful, most impactful pieces I can take from that. And so then I put those in my 3 bullets. And then I also try to do a key phrase or a key term or something like that. It's why the first thing that popped up in my mind about David and Goliath was remote missive. I mean, I've written it down. I actually have a note card that I write remote missive down with a little, comment to myself about what it means. But, so when I hear David and Goliath, I think remote missives. When I think upstream, I think of scarcity and tunneling. Those things now stick out in my brain because not to get too into it, but in the Katherine Tucker podcast, you talked about powerful teaching. One of the things, some of the points in there about retrieval practice, and this is kind of like my form of retrieval practice. If you keep coming back to it, if you summarize and come back to it, so that's really what I'm doing. And then I'm trying to take those, and I have found for me, if I'm working through those personally, if I use those in my personal life, it has to carry over into my professional world. And when I've done it professionally, it hasn't always carried over to my personal life. So I'm trying to do those things in my personal life and then see that carry over professionally.
That's fantastic. And I appreciate that. I also want to just identify with the listeners for a minute. You dropping books is a conscious decision. This isn't you getting tired and moving on. So we're not lily padding here. And I want to draw a clear distinction for the listeners. It's a conscious decision. The 50 pages doesn't capture you. You don't have time to continue going down this road if it's not going to benefit you. So you drop it. You just cut your losses. I think a lot of people have problems with that because, oh, look, I purchased the book, I need to finish it. But I think it's important to recognize it's a conscious decision. It's not like suddenly I just lost interest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a behavioral issue. I'm experiencing that. I'm not going and just buying every new bestseller because it is a bestseller. And I think that's something listeners have to be cautious of. So I'm glad to hear you say it's a conscious decision. The only other part I was going to mention is Og Mandino. I look forward to hearing what you think of him. He's totally different. Og Mandino wrote a book, The Greatest Salesman in the World, which was introduced to me in my very early 20s. We talk about trauma-informed care and things like that. Well, I took an ACEs test one time for that adverse childhood experiences and scored really high without knowing ACEs at the time. Now we're talking, 25 years later, right? So some significant time has passed. I knew if I needed to get to another level in my own life, personal life and professional life, I needed to just think differently. Og Mandino, W. Clement Stone, Napoleon Hill. These were early books introduced to me, that a lot of, those within the sales profession listen to, because you get beat up so much. How do you handle rejection and pivot, with a smile? So that's hard. And so those books really became attracted to me. So I'm interested when you do read that, and they're quick reads. They're very quick reads. I'll be interested to hear how that resonates with you, and his style of writing and his message. It's deep but simple.
I'm all over it. I love it. And let me just comment real quick. Sorry, back on your first point there was that I think going back to the blog, when I've not always been a reader. I really, that's not been my whole life. It's probably been the last 3 years that I really got into reading. And it did start with just a number, right? I was trying to reach a number. And so dropping a book was like, well, how can I drop a book? I only got 100 pages left. I'll check it off, And, but it really did leave me unfulfilled. It was like I was setting a goal of 2 or 3 books a month. And then you'd read, and I read 3 books, and you're like, yeah, but I didn't get anything from them. And so eventually that switched over to, I'm doing this to get something out of it, not to say I read 3 books a month. That really didn't matter, because who really cares, right? I can't tout that to too many people, and they care. So it was really about me, and eventually it did turn into a system for me. So
yeah, so it's also how you get to 6. Because a lot of people are bored with the book they're reading, so they're not reading it every day. Mm-hmm. And so they're trying to get to the end of the book versus being thrilled by it. And so you get to that 6 or whatever the number ends up being, which is a lot of reading, right? The average CEO reads about 60 books a year. You don't get to that number by reading boring books that you don't feel like reading. So it's interesting that it does go back to the H gap, because by dropping the book that you didn't like, you actually end up reading more for the fulfillment. So it's a great connection. It's a great connection to that H gap. And so I really think that that's a strategy that people will cling on to. Let's get into, you mentioned the podcast. So let's get into that, if you don't mind. Katherine Tucker, she's a powerhouse, blended learning. We really had a good time on that show. What did you get from it? Because I know you listened to it, and I'll just plug this. I know you listened to it in its entirety, because I also know you drop podcasts too. When you're not interested halfway through, you stop listening. So I know you apply that to your listening as well. And listen, this is another tip for the audience. It doesn't mean that you won't come back to it at some time in your life, because I know I've prompted you on podcasts. You were like, I didn't really like that for the first 30 minutes. So I stopped listening, and I'm like, no. It gets good in minute. Right. I think the last one you were like, it didn't get good till minute 42, and you had stopped at 35.
It was a 44-minute podcast, and it didn't get good for me until minute 41. So, and I had dropped it early, and you were like, no, you got to finish it. I said,
but then it's well worth the first 40 minutes. That one I know of, and that's a revisionist history episode. But talk to us about Katherine Tucker and what you took from that podcast.
Here's the thing. I said it to you. I thought this was your best podcast. I'm not exactly sure what it was. I could feel the connection between the 3 of you guys. It just seemed, and I know both of you, personally. So I just felt like this was the one that I saw both of your personalities there, and Katherine, I have followed her on some of her stuff, blended learning. She also does some stuff around grading, which is my big thing. And so, in fact, some people, I've talked to a couple of my staff who went to go see Katherine Tucker at a conference a couple years ago, and quickly texted them and said, hey, if you haven't listened to this podcast, check it out. She's on there. She did a phenomenal job. I love, and you mentioned 2 books that I've really enjoyed. Again, Make It Stick was one of my favorites. I do say, like, that's one of those books, though, I had to read every page at least 2 or 3 times to actually understand it. So, but again, that was gripping for me. So it wasn't that it got boring. It was like I would read it and say, I have this person wrote this is way smarter than me, so I'm gonna have to read that again, and sometimes a third time. But it really stuck with me about how the brain works, and powerful teaching, same model, just really meant for education and right, yeah, and it's just and that's where we're immersed in that right now. So I really like that discussion. But I thought the banter between the three of you guys it was great. I'm telling you, it was my favorite podcast for you guys. That's why I said this was a great month to have me on, because I think this was your best blog. I think this was your best podcast. And you mentioned two of my favorite books upstream. I mean, come on,
Well, Nick, we truly appreciate that. And I would like to think, TJ and I, as educational practitioners, we have some of our own growth to do. So it's nice to hear you thinking our interviewing skills are getting better and really digging into topics with those we're interviewing. But I agree, that was an easy flow podcast. And I really, one major takeaway, and you can touch on this as well. What I liked about Catlin and her answers, she revealed her struggle a little bit.
Yeah.
Her struggle as a first year teacher. I think if I remember correctly, she acknowledged that it was year 5 that really look, I may actually leave the profession if something doesn't start getting better. And we always talk about, and I know you as a principal, Nick, you can't invest 5 years with an individual, and obviously who's a dynamo, who's now questioning whether or not they made the right professional decision. Mm-hmm. So now she said she kind of turned this around. But the major takeaway for me also was, wow, as a educational leader, how do I make sure my staff don't feel that way? Yeah. Or how can we onboard them in a way? Because if she's feeling this, and she's obviously a dynamo, how many others are feeling it? So that was a kind of one of those hidden messages along that line that just struck me when she revealed that.
Yeah, to me, it wasn't that hidden. I mean, I really felt like when she was vulnerable and said that, I was thinking, wow, here's somebody who's on the circuit, right? Many people in education know who she is, and they know the topics that she's strong in. To hear that in the first couple of years of teaching, she was thinking about getting out. I thought was really powerful. And so, yeah, that wasn't too hidden for me. I thought that was great, yeah. and great for her for being vulnerable. She talked about Brene Brown, and I know Brene always talks about being vulnerable. And so that was a nice tie-in too. But I thought that was really powerful for any new teacher or right now, right? I mean, everybody is a new teacher. We keep saying this, you might have been a master teacher. You could have been teacher of the year last year. We're all brand new teachers, and it's a struggle. And so just kind of hearing that, made me think, yeah, we're all going through that right now. We all feel like it's a major struggle, which again, kind of perfect time for that. Read this series of overcoming obstacles. So.
Yeah. And also the line that she had in that podcast that I liked the best was that you don't have to be an expert. So it's awesome to hear an expert, we would consider her to be an expert, say that you don't have to be an expert. Right. Because I think a lot of people who struggle with their own hindrances, it's because they're looking for perfection. Mm-hmm. And it's better to look for progress. And so, actually perfection could be the opposite of progress sometimes. And, I thought that was awesome where she would just said, look, you don't have to be the expert. And I would just offer that as advice for any teacher or leader out there right now in COVID. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to do it perfectly. You just have to move forward every day. And that's what's going to get you from where you are now to where you want to be. This has been really fun, Nick, having you on the show. Yeah. We reviewed the content for the month. We reflected on it together. We heard from you as a practitioner, as a principal, lots of growth strategies for our audience. Is there any last words that you would like to add for our listeners?
Nothing more than I think you guys are getting better, which it's a great point, Joe. And again, it's feedback. And you mentioned on it was either this podcast or the one with Jethro where you said we wrote a book on feedback. Now everybody wants to give us feedback. But it's a great point to know. I've seen you guys from the very beginning, and seeing that growth. Exactly. Right. And seeing the growth over time. And I definitely feel like everything's getting stronger, and it's tighter too. The message and how everything's tying together is just super strong. The connection between the H gap and the Read This series and the conversation with Catlin just were so connected. I just thought it was great. You guys are doing great work, and I know it's a major benefit for me. So I'm sure everybody who's going to watch this or listen to this feels the same.
Truly appreciate that, Nick, and we'll continue to do our best to deliver a powerful leadership series every month. And I'll say the whole reason TJ and I started this was to really iron sharpens iron. It was designed never to go beyond us two, and then really like think about a book or think about a podcast. It never was really about that. And now I think we've just seen it benefit our own leadership, and these type of conversations. When I hear you saying you're reading 6 a month, I mean, if that's not a call to action for some people or a challenge to some people, they're asleep. So I appreciate all you're doing, all that you've done with your school. It's impressive. And you're definitely well known as a fantastic leader. So we appreciate having you here.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great first video episode of our Review and Reflect series. Thanks, Nick, for being on. We reviewed this month. We reflected on it. You can get that content at theschoolhouse302.com. Don't forget to like, follow, and we thank you for watching. And by the way, this episode was also sponsored by the Principal Seminar. You can go to theprincipalseminar.com. Check out 3 and 3 years of content in 3 weeks to catch you up. If you're a new principal or a new assistant principal, you need to check out 3 and 3. Again, principalseminar.com, principalseminar.com. Go there, check it out. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.